Possible fight of the night at featherweight between Alex Caceres, you know him as Bruce Leeroy, he's taking on Giga Chikadze, and Matt, I'm all kinds of excited about this one. We were so excited to get Alex Caceres and Giga Chikadze. Then Chikadze's out. We got excited for Kevin Kroom and Alex Caceres. Well, the hard-hitting hillbilly is out of this fight in steps. Listen. The Pacific Northwest, Austin Springer, you might be familiar with him from his time on Dana White's Contender Series Season 2. He got a third-round rear naked choke over Giga Chikadze. So you must probably think, well, Austin Springer, he's a lock to beat Alex Caceres. Whoa, pump the brakes. But maybe you're also not totally familiar with Austin Springer. So let's go through the breakdown, and we'll talk a little bit about that fight that he had against Giga Chikadze on Contender Series. So it was a somewhat lackluster performance up until the submission. I mean, the first round, bit of a feeling out process. You know how good of a striker Giga Chikadze is. So Springer had to kind of swipe away some of those attempts, use his striking to close the distance, work some takedowns. He was in a few compromising positions against a very, very non-grappler in Chikadze. You know him for that excellent kickboxing ability, like I just mentioned. Second round, it was pretty close. Gave it to Chikadze. In the third round, Chikadze started to make a few mistakes. Springer able to capitalize it, get down, get into mount, hammer away. Chikadze gave the back, and Springer, it was a quick sink of the choke, and Chikadze tapped very quickly. So that's how that fight went. You also might recognize him from The Ultimate Fighter Season 22, one of my favorite seasons of The Ultimate Fighter. Of course, we got such lines as, there's a little snake in the grass. But ultimately, in that season, he was ousted in the early round, the first round, before teams even got picked. He fought Chris Grutzmacher, a guy that fans are familiar with, or maybe you're not, but finished in that fight. So then Austin Springer goes back, pro fight, takes on Steven Seiler. You might know him from the UFC, you might know him from the PFL. He got finished in that fight. He beat Toby Misek, who you might know from Bellator, and I keep saying these guys that you might know, maybe you don't. And then after that, lost to Juicy J. No, not the rapper that sings with KP, but the one that fights by finish. And then he lost the fight to Bobby McIntyre, who was 4-4. Now, that's pretty salty, and we're going back a bit. Now, he's on a 3-fight win streak coming up on 2.5 years. The Chikadze win peppered in there. He won his last fight, but it was almost a year ago, so we haven't seen a lot out of Austin Springer. Again, I've talked quite a bit. The only other touching or talking points that I wanted to get to, Austin Springer coming out of the Pacific Northwest. I mentioned it, Vancouver, Washington. He owns Vancouver Elite MMA. Who else is out of that city, Matt?
Chael Sonnen?
Well, maybe, but not really. Greg Biffle.
Greg Biffle.
NASCAR's Greg Biffle from Vancouver, Washington, just across the way from Portland, Oregon. But other than owning that gym, like I said, training out of one of the best gyms, going really under Fabiano Scherner. You know some of those training partners, Austin Vanderford, Chael Sonnen, like you had mentioned, Ricky Simone, the list goes on and on. So Springer, pretty good lineage, owns an MMA gym, owns an amateur MMA promotion. He's got a lot of things going for him. He's also not a big fan of Rick Story. Go look into that story from about 5 years ago. That's what I've got on Austin Springer. As far as this fight's concerned, and all honesty and all the cards on the table, we picked Chikadze to beat Caceres, so there's going to be a little bit of that bias here. But this overall should be a really good fight because you have Austin Springer, where I've gone 3.5 minutes into a video without letting Matt have a shot.
It's all good.
We've had Austin Springer, who he's one of those kind of complete martial artists. You kind of know he has a lot more knockout wins than anything. 7 of his 12 wins are by knockout or TKO. But in a fight like this, I would think he's probably going to want to take it to the mat.
Oh, for sure. Now, Alex Caceres, for the longest time, all of his opponents knew he's such a good striker. We're all just going to try to pressure grapple, pressure wrestle him. And that's kind of what the likes of Jason Knight was able to do. You just kind of wait for him to make a mistake with all that unorthodox movement. And then once he does kind of give his back, just drag him to the ground. And if you are a really credentialed grappler, you will have a level of success against Alex Caceres, especially if you can get him to the ground. Because just defensively, he leaves a lot to be desired on the ground. Now, Chase Hooper, I know that was a bit of a different story. Just Hooper's so young in his MMA career. Like, that's a big ask to ask someone in their second UFC fight to beat a guy like Alex Caceres, who he's still quite young. He has a lot of fights, 16-12. The record's a little salty, but he's really only fought the best of the best for the majority of his career. Because when you think about it, and I don't mean the best of the best like in the UFC, I just mean he's been in the UFC for such a large part of his career. Like, he came in off of the Ultimate Fighter season where Josh Koscheck coached against George St. Pierre. So that just tells you how long of a tenure he's been able to keep.
Yeah, and I mean, Alex Caceres, so I like what you said. I mean, Martin Bravo, Ocho
Some of
Peterson,
no,
I don't know.
The
But
UFC names aren't the best, but he's been in the UFC for almost 10 years now, and there's something to be said just for that.
so if you look at Alex Caceres for the parts and pieces, and if you look at the totality of his career and the UFC's featherweight division, for the all-time rankings with UFC stats, he ranks 10th in the division with significant strike accuracy at 49.3%. He also ranks 7th in like this is out of the McGregors, the Aldos, the Mendezes, the Holloways, the
Volkanovski.
Poiriers at one point, and on and on. He ranks 7th in significant strike defense at 66.6%. So it's kind of crazy to think about that. Now, again, level of talent, maybe not on par with some of those top guys, but he's been there for a long time. It's a big sample size. The other thing that scares me, and this is the number where if you're a big Austin Springer fan, Alex Caceres' takedown defense over his UFC career is 59%. And then if you go back and look at the Ocho, the Steven Peterson fight, he got taken down twice in that one. He also got taken down 3 times by Martin Bravo.
Yeah, that's not really a great look for... Yeah, that's a really bad... but Alex Caceres, you kind of know what you're going to get no matter what the opponent is, and that's what I'm not overly concerned about with the late notice of opponent change, because Austin Springer, I know he doesn't fight like Giga Chikadze, but Alex Caceres kind of has the same game plan no matter what. He's very much a striking specialist, so no matter what his opponent's throwing at him, he has to defend more takedowns now. That's about it for him. Now, it will be interesting because Alex Caceres is a guy who... He moves so much, it's going to depend on how much Austin Springer can cut the cage off. Because if Austin Springer is able to kind of get into range, constantly push Caceres back, if he can get him up against the cage, I could see Austin Springer having some success there. But the problem is the range that Alex Caceres is able to keep and the fact that he uses footwork quite a bit. So if he can start chopping down that front leg of Austin Springer, really uses kicks well, I think he'll be able to create a lot of distance. And it's going to be really hard for Austin Springer to at least close it to go for a takedown at that point.
Now, again, we saw him do that against Chikadze to an extent. I would say, and Chikadze at the time, still somewhat young in his MMA career because he fought, 4 or 5 years ago, and then things were spaced out a little bit. So you had to kind of take that fight with a bit of a grain of salt. You've seen what Chikadze could do in the UFC against some of the guys that he's fought so far. I know the first 2 fights were split decision wins, but in his last one, he looked really good. But for Springer, it's kind of the inactivity that worries me a little bit. I'm not concerned about those losses. I just brought them up because it's a talking point. Here's another talking point about Austin Springer if I haven't talked about him enough. As a pro, he's won titles at 135, 145, and 155 on the regional scene. On his UFCmedia.com page, he said that he won amateur titles at 45, 55, and 70. Now, I couldn't confirm that, and I also looked up his amateur MMA record, and he had a fight where a guy weighed 159 and a title fight at 155, so maybe we're stretching the truth. Maybe it's the truth. I don't know. They also said Ji-Yeon Kim was a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and if you go onto her Instagram, she's certainly a brown belt, so who knows what's what. But in terms of fact-checking, Austin Springer, again, you look at it, the inactivity, I worry about this one a little bit for him coming in on such short notice. The other thing, too, we don't have odds on this because this fight was just recently announced. If you go over on Tapology, again, limited sample size, 374 votes, 84% of fans going with Caceres to get the win. Overwhelming majority there as well, picking him to win by decision. That would be the safe pick. That was the pick that I put in on Tapology. You can find me. It's me at Fight Night Picks over on Tapology. But I'm going with Caceres by that margin of victory. You saw it in his last 2 fights. The other thing that I really like about Caceres in his last fight against Chase Hooper, and again, it wasn't a tough test for Caceres. He was an underdog, though. He was all
in hindsight
bridging on a 2-1 underdog, or 1-2, or however you want to say it. I'm just kidding around. His total strikes, the thing that I like, he went 35 in the first round, 27 in the second round, 47 in the third. You could see that output kind of starting to go up a little bit, or, it was a wave. So I like that out of Caceres, especially at this point in his career, and I think Springer is a beatable opponent for him.
Yeah, I just think Alex Caceres is kind of a nightmare guy for you to keep on having a UFC debut or kind of an early fight against. He's very much a veteran. He's fought some big names in the division, too. I mean, he had a main event spot against Yair Rodriguez. He's fought Sergio Pettis. He's fought Uriah Faber. Like, he has been in there with some really, really good fighters that a lot of people forget about just because he's been in the UFC for so long. So, without a doubt, Alex Caceres has fought a better level of competition than Austin Springer, and he's fought fighters better than Austin Springer. And I think that just really all that experience is going to be able to help him a lot in this. Decision's a safe pick because for as good of a striker as Caceres is, there's not a lot of pop behind much of his shots. He's more he's very accurate with them. He keeps you at range, but it's not like he's the most heavy-handed guy in the world. So I just think he'll kind of accurately be able to outclass Springer on the feet.
Yeah, it's a really interesting fight. You brought it up. I mean, he has a submission win over Sergio Pettis. He also has a split decision loss to Yair Rodriguez in a main event. So crazy. Both of us going with Alex Caceres. The late minute video, the late Hail Mary with Alex Caceres and Austin Springer. Make sure you check out the rest of the videos in the playlist, including an extended look at our main event between Anthony Smith and Alexander Rakic. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it.